thank you guys all so much for coming out. I'm delighted to be here in this particular place, in a museum and cultural institution dedicated to trying to understand how the built environment works and operates, because that's very much how I see my work. And this book very much comes out of a lot of different strands, so I'll tell you guys a little bit about the book and some of the sort of contextual influences that led to it. And then I hope we can have a conversation about what any of these words mean: city making, culture, craft, practical urbanism. It's an invented word that for me really goes, oftentimes when I'm lecturing or teaching, I'm I consider myself an urbanist. But when I find increasingly when I talk with that language of urbanism, the way that is understood, to the extent that it is very much as an urbanist is someone who studies urban dynamics from a sort of academic reserve. And for me, I was looking for a term that could unite the various practices that I covered over 6 years at the Architectural League, editing Urban Omnibus, that was a little bit more active. Because I think oftentimes when we think about active processes of making cities, we have a pretty limited understanding of what exactly that means. I think oftentimes when we think about city making, we think of images like this. This is Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I write about quite favorably in the book, in the chapter on public space. But this kind of sort of completed environment that is kind of delivered to the public wholesale as a complete space that, as this image beautifully evokes, is primarily about the sort of consumption of urban experience as a visible scene, is by no means the extent of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about how to make cities. Landscape architecture and design is an incredibly important aspect of what I'm talking about, but by no means the extent. Same thing here, a really remarkable piece of architecture that I write about in a book that has, obviously it comes from an architectural milieu, but there's very few architectural projects actually talked about in the book. This is one of them, the 34th Street Ferry Terminal by Kennedy Violich Architects, which I also write about as a really wonderful example of a multitasking infrastructure. But again, these kinds of complete environments, as wonderful as they are, designed by designers and paid for by clients, whether the public sector or private sector, isn't the extent of what I consider to be city making. For me, the word goes further than design, further than sort of real estate finance and development, and also includes the people who actively build the built environment, and those who volunteer. In the book, I don't distinguish between those people who are professionally involved in making cities and neighborhoods, and those who dedicate their volunteer hours or extra time to making their neighborhoods a little bit better. This is an image I'll talk about in a little bit more depth a little later from Corona Plaza in Queens, a really sort of remarkable example of a kind of public space creation that came about through a bunch of sort of ground-up community-based efforts, not sort of a client and design process. And I think we need both of those kinds of examples when we talk about public space, but also all kinds of other kinds of ways in which we make cities and neighborhoods. It also includes, this kind of active stewardship of the built environment. For me, stewardship and maintenance is an incredibly important part of city making. And so I write at great length about people like this who just volunteer to water beds of flowers. This is right where I used to live along the Gowanus Canal. And this is a picture of a woman named Beverly, who farms in what was formerly a vacant lot in East New York. And I think all of these different kinds of practices, ranging from design, landscape design, architecture, working in the municipal workforce, volunteering your time to make public space or to take care of public space or to actually actively grow food in public space, are all very much important pieces of the puzzle. And one of the most important aspects of city making that I really wanted to lift up and celebrate in this work is what I think is kind of the least heralded as we talk about cities, and as cities have become increasingly over the last 15, 20 years, things that people are very excited about, living in or being a part of or studying. I think one of the things that get lost is public servants. I love this image. Almost all the images in this presentation and most of the images in the book were taken by a wonderful photographer named Alex Fradkin, who really has an infectious enthusiasm for the built environment of New York and its neighborhoods, which I think really comes through in the visual material in the book. But I love this because it's a downtown office building that really evokes to me some in its use of reflection. The fact that we often only think about public service and public servants when something breaks, like the water main outside here, and think less about what's happening on the other side of the building, inside, oftentimes, windowless rooms, public servants working for years on projects, the kinds of projects that you'll never necessarily be able to cut a ribbon on the way you can on a shiny new park or public facility, but nonetheless are a crucial, important piece of the puzzle here. So all of these different kinds of city making were all stories that we would tell week to week on Urban Omnibus. And Urban Omnibus, it no longer looks like this. It's gone through a wonderful redesign, and I urge you guys all to check out urbanomnibus.net and see the incredible stories of urban innovation as well as urban interpretation that continue to be produced at the League. But this is what it looked like when I was editor there. And it comes from a long legacy, the Architectural League, which was founded way back in 1881 as a society for architectural study. This was at a time when there were very few options for the professional study of architecture in this country. And so a group of architects got together to give each other sketch problems and then invite grandmasters of the tradition to come and critique them. So it started out very much as a sketch club, and it has maintained that thread of a mutual education society with an incredible community of architects and designers that at various points it has really sort of pushed the needle forward in terms of marshaling the power of that community of architectural thought towards issues of public concern in New York City, especially in the last 30 years under the leadership of Rosalie Ginevra. I just learned that one of the studies that is one of my favorite things the League produced long before my time way back in '87 was cooked up in your living room.
Yeah.
So we have a full circle institutional through line there. But these are some of the design studies from Rosalie's early days at the League that I think really speak to this impulse on the part of the organization to what do you do when you have this incredible community of designers around you, and how can you actually marshal that towards issues of public concern? At times focusing on issues that not a lot of people were necessarily talking about, such as scattered site infill housing in vacant lots, or how to make public schools economically viable at smaller scales, etc. And so in 2008, if you can think back, way back to 2008, there's an incredible show here right now about the 90s, which seems even further away. But 2008, while it maybe seems like that was just a decade ago, it was a very different world in terms of how urban stories were reported and how urban stories were understood and how urbanism itself was understood, in part because of the sort of vagaries of our international financial system. In 2008, the iPhone was less than a year old at this point. Newspapers were in crisis. There was actual real concern about the viability of the New York Times. And right around this time is when the New York Times closed its city section. And really, there was a distinct sort of disconnect that a lot of us were observing between the wealth of interest around cities and neighborhoods as places to hang out in, places to explore, places to live in, if you had the means. Disconnect between that level of interest and excitement and the ways in which stories of urban innovation were reported. We found that there was sort of neighborhood-specific microblogging culture that was reporting on issues within a neighborhood to people in that neighborhood, but that weren't obviously sort of being transferred across those geographic boundaries. And at the same time, a lot of incredible innovation that was happening in the disciplines, in landscape architecture, engineering, civil, public service, were also only being communicated in very narrow silos of interest. And so one of Rosalie's initial desires was to create an online forum that would bring together all of these various different voices from New York City, from across New York City, so that New Yorkers in different disciplines and different neighborhoods could learn from what was happening in ways that other sort of traditional reporting was not necessarily making available to them. And so what this evolved into was essentially a weekly publication, where each week we would produce what we like to think of as good ideas for the future of cities worldwide that were tried and tested in the 5 boroughs of New York. And the goal there was really to do something that was comparative and had a sort of geographic specificity, but that was tied to sort of questions and challenges that cities large and small across the world are grappling with and continue to. And especially in the early years, most of these were in the first person. We did a lot of interviews. One week it'd be with an architect, the next week an engineer, the next week a public artist who works in neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. And what I realized sort of late in the game, several years into this exercise, is that what I had on my hands was a kind of oral history of sorts, albeit not a scientific cross-section of everything that had taken place, but a curated sample that very much sort of did track with a lot of trends that were happening within a variety of different disciplines that weren't quite managing to bubble up into a single conversation about cities and how they develop, and crucially to me, how we want them to develop. It was very important to me as I sort of got to know more and more the wide range of people who dedicate such passion and enthusiasm to making cities and neighborhoods just a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more just or inclusive, a little bit more beautiful and stimulating, that within that passion and enthusiasm were embedded a set of ethics that we find that we don't actually have a great vocabulary for talking about when we talk about cities. Of course, there are always moral debates within it, and it's not like we all necessarily share exactly the same values vis-a-vis the role of the market or the proper offices of government, etc. However, I find that that has led to a sort of depoliticization of urbanism to the point where it's very hard to talk about normative principles of what kind of cities do we want without speaking in sort of vapid platitudes about, we want them to be more inclusive and resilient, but when you get into that, how does it actually mean, and how does it actually mean we need to turn the screws of what we're talking about when we talk about cities? So I realized that I had this archive, this oral history, and that within it was a really sort of incredible opportunity to retell a bunch of these stories, and do so through the lens of a broad reading of the intellectual history of urbanism that could actually lead us towards some ethical imperatives for what kind of city we want. So it breaks down. I'm going to skip over. I was going to tell you a little bit about my own work as a filmmaker and how this informs my deep conviction that that city making is not just about sort of those people who actively intervene in the built environment, but also those who interpret the built environment, and that kind of interpretation is itself a form of city making. But I'm going to skip over that so we can get to a conversation. So I took this oral history and sort of drew from it, distilled from it a series of ethical imperatives for 4 major sort of categories of practical urbanism: public space, infrastructure, information technology, and housing. Now, it's important to note that there are huge aspects of practical urbanism that are outside the scope of this book, most notably, I think, transportation. Any sort of urbanist or city maker worth his or her salt, I think, really does need to be apprised of infrastructural and technological advances in transportation. But for what I was working on, these were the main categories that kept coming up again and again, and really sort of led me to develop this series of imperatives. So the first one is the public space imperative. Incorporate long-term use and maintenance, along with the practice of citizenship, into any discussion of public space design and delivery. So this is that image, I said I would come back to it again, from Corona Plaza, which, if you don't know, is this really sort of amazing example of what happens when people come together to respond to local demands and needs. This is one of the most, in terms of nativity, one of the most diverse places in the country, if not the world. A tremendously vibrant mix of different immigrant enclaves, primarily from South Asia and South America, but from everywhere. You can find people from everywhere in the world. And it's not that this neighborhood has a complete absence of public space. It is not that far from Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. However, there was a deep need for a very particular kind of public space, an informal gathering and convening series of spaces that the formal spaces of the park were not providing. And so the story that is told here is what happened when sort of an endogenous effort of local business owners started out just by sort of stringing Christmas tree lights and doing a couple sort of maintenance activities around the park, that then eventually led to attract the attention of the Queen's Museum, which is an incredible supporter of this project, which brought in artists who held classes and helped to really sort of organize the community around making this a performance space. Then the DOT got involved. They got a grant from the Department of Transportation that included some planters and bollards, and they got it demapped as a street. But it really is a very interesting example of a kind of public space that in the book is sort of contrasted as a complement with something like the High Line, which I absolutely love as a space, but came about with a very different set of sort of real estate economics as well as efforts. But public space also includes things I mentioned, like the active stewardship, which is not just necessarily taking care of space, but turning it into something productive and new. This is another image from East New York, where East New York, the story of East New York Farms was the very first story we launched with when we first premiered Urban Omnibus in January of 2009. At that point in time, I'm not sure what the statistics are now, over 50% of the fresh produce consumed in East New York was grown in East New York. Which is both a happy story about the sort of entrepreneurship of these local farmers. It's also a sad story about the state of food deserts and the sort of scarcity of available fresh food in the neighborhood. But it's not just, when I'm talking about public space stewardship and incorporating active stewardship and maintenance into how we define public space over time, I'm not exclusively talking about, deeply worthy social justice efforts in chronically disinvested neighborhoods like East New York. I'm also talking about mirthful, fun, spontaneous interventions such as this. This is another image from near the Gowanus Canal, where we chronicled a group of young architects who set up a series of informal ad hoc birdhouses along the canal. And one of the things that comes up again and again in all the various stories in the book has to do with sort of the unintended multitasking consequences of some of these interventions. This was something that a bunch of guys did sort of as a fun, informal group exercise. And it was important to them, I think, that this kind of intervention, which was incredibly easy and incredibly replicable, would help people to understand that this incredibly putrid, toxic waterway was also a habitat. So that was sort of a stated objective of the project. What the unintended consequences were was the way in which this very simple ad hoc, informal, low-fidelity system then made organizing efforts for group volunteer cleanup days that much easier because of this simple sort of way of recognizing the space as a habitat. Made it a whole lot easier for local nonprofits in the area to get people to come and help them clean it up. The next imperative is about infrastructure, and here what kept coming up again in my research as well as in the stories that I was recounting was the need for us to reconceive infrastructure as a multifunction public good and a constituent element of landscape. So in this I'm talking about hard infrastructures like this. This is the Verrazano Bridge. As well as much softer infrastructures that I'll talk about in a moment. But the chapter sort of starts, and again, one of the most fun aspects for me of putting this all together in book form was the opportunity it gave me to sort of dig deep into the city as an archive itself. Because while Urban Omnibus started as sort of a platform to share urban innovation, anyone who studies urban innovation with any kind of historical lens realizes that nothing's ever really quite as new as it seems, and in fact many of the most innovative ideas that people were coming up with were in fact reclaiming, with knowledge or without knowledge, ideas that had been in various incarnations sort of brought to the fore before. You'll be forgiven for not necessarily recognizing this as the Manhattan Chinatown entrance to Manhattan Bridge. But it is, I think, it does speak to this notion that once back in the day, in the era of Beaux-Arts planning and design, infrastructure was conceived as an organizing framework and principle for landscape and monumental and majestic public spaces. which has very much been forgotten. And you definitely saw within the stories that I was telling a real emphasis on understanding the negative consequences of how the more and more in the modern era since the 50s we've so tightly wound form and function together with infrastructural projects that it leads to a real acceleration of their brittleness. But I'm also talking about things that we wouldn't necessarily even recognize visibly as infrastructure. One of my favorite stories that I recount in the book is the story of the Staten Island Blue Belt. And this is a series of basically engineered wetlands to try and reintroduce some kind of green infrastructure, stormwater retention to Staten Island, because after the Verrazano Bridge was built in 1964, the borough grew exponentially, and this sort of suburban single-family homes carpeted out over what had been primarily rural farmland up until that point. And that sort of subdivision and land development happened well in advance of any kind of attempts to create a modern sewage system. So you have, anytime it rains, water slashing off all of these rooftops and roadways and carrying with it a tremendous amount of pollutants directly into the harbor. But what I love so much about the Staten Island Blue Belt project is this is a project that came about because a visionary group of urban planners at the Department of City Planning way back in the 70s recognized this problem, recognized that a traditional infrastructural approach to creating a sewer system was not feasible in terms of capital and also in terms of the technology that would be required and the expense. So they set about in incredibly painstaking ways buying up little sort of edges of lots, using in some cases a benign version of eminent domain, to really try and re-engineer the natural wetland stream system that had once been there before it was overdeveloped. And one of the things I loved about this story, and the reason it resonated with me so powerfully, was what I was talking about at the beginning. The Dana Gum, the person who, after working at City Planning on this project, worked at the Department of Environmental Protection for many years. He's been working on this for 30 years. And it takes that kind of scale for a project of this magnitude to actually come to fruition. And I just felt such an incredible surge of respect for so many public servants who can work thanklessly in windowless offices miles away from the effects of their decisions. His office is in Elmhurst, Queens, and doesn't have any windows. And there's just the scale of imagination and dedication, as well as sort of tolerance for bureaucracy. I think really is something that needs to be celebrated and held up in dialogue with innovative architectural or landscape architectural or infrastructural things that are visible. And again, as I mentioned, it's very important to me to juxtapose stories of intervention with stories of interpretation. This is a self-portrait of a sewer diver named Steve Duncan, who has been, started out as a self-described punk kid who liked to go places he wasn't allowed to go, which led to a long history of exploring subterranean New York. And he became sort of obsessed with the design details of our, Victorian sewage system, which causes a tremendous infrastructural challenge today with combined sewage overflows and a bunch of other sort of environmental issues associated with this. But his contention, which I greatly appreciate, is that in order to really to advocate for any kind of systemic change with these large infrastructural systems, you have to be able to see them and understand them. And one of the goals with Urban Omnibus from the very beginning that was very important to me and comes from my own training as a filmmaker was the desire to use the resource of Urban Omnibus as an instrument to encourage greater intimacy with the choices that go into the built environment. And I think Steve Duncan is a great example of sort of that, with his sort of sumptuous long exposure photographs is his particular vehicle for doing so, but it shares the core contention that making systems visible and legible is an incredibly important part of being able to take the step to advocate for the kinds of changes and investments that we want. In the technology chapter, and again, huge aspects of technology are outside the scope of this book, I was primarily interested in information technology, and I was primarily interested, the stories that I tell in this chapter are very much seeking to push back against the kind of creeping positivism that's reemerging within the ways in which technology is going to save us from everything. The imperative here is to think inductively, to complement measurement with close observation, and embrace technologies that support, rather than disrupt, democratic governance. Because at this point, particularly when we started in 2009 and it's sort of intensifying, I think around the peak was around 2012, there was this huge trend within sort of the techno-urbanist, techno-optimist set of using the benefits of information technology and smartphones and sort of Web 2.0 techniques to kind of get around bureaucracy in some way or another, in ways that had this sort of veneer of democratizing decision-making, but were in fact anything but democratic in terms of the opaqueness of how they were done. So you have, things like this. This is an ad about Hudson Yards, of quantified living, of a neighborhood entirely packed to the brim with sensors that can, in many important ways, deliver on an efficiency dividend to a certain extent, and I'm not, opposed to that on principle, but at certain costs that I think we really need to understand, particularly when it comes to things that appear to be democratizing but are in fact consolidating the control of our decision-making in fewer and fewer hands. The optimistic stories that I really drew from this are about projects that not only take technology and distribute it in new ways, but also distribute the knowledge and the tools to create and understand that technology. So this is a story, this is an image of Redbook WiFi. And this story I tell is very much, comes in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. Redbook, as I'm sure all of you know, was devastated by the storm, lost power, and realized that the entire neighborhood was entirely dependent on one internet service provider. And you have a lot of people, the majority of the residents, about 75%, live in one of the largest public housing complexes in the country, the Redbook houses. This is a rooftop of one of them, whose statistics do not compare favorably with a lot of other chronically disinvested or underinvested communities of color in New York. But what I loved about this project was, they created a community-owned internet service provider for themselves, which not only had the infrastructure to create their own community-owned broadband and Wi-Fi, but also had sort of neighborhood-specific portals and neighborhood-specific apps. One of the apps they created tracked the only bus that takes you from the neighborhood to the subway station, which is over a mile away. It's incredibly poorly served by public transit and cut off from the rest of, cut off literally by a highway for the more prosperous neighborhoods of Brownstone, Brooklyn. But what was even more important to me than the community taking ownership of their own internet infrastructure was the way in which they use this as a youth development strategy and a workforce development strategy. Really distributing not only the internet access, but the ability to actually understand how to create it in a market which is increasingly demanding technological skills and know-how without necessarily increasing the opportunities for acquiring those skills. And I thought, and I'll end with this example, that since we are in this beautiful museum dedicated to understanding how buildings and the built environment work, one of the stories that, one of the intellectual history examples that was really wonderful for me to rediscover was the story of Patrick Geddes. When I was particularly, and I came to him actually while I was doing research on the technology chapter, and reading a lot about models of civic participation, which is of course what a lot of the sort of techno apps of Web 2.0 were promising. The way that he, his definition of civics and what he thought about how we could actually use something like a museum to put a mirror to the world and again advance that idea that the best way to understand a city was to learn through looking at it. And this was, of course, more than half a century before Jane Jacobs was using learning through looking as sort of a way to stop the egregiousness of the meat axe approach of Robert Moses. I mean, one of the things that really comes about very powerfully, I hope, through all of the examples of the book, is this need to sort of get beyond that dichotomy between exclusively top-down approaches to urban form and exclusively bottom-up ones. The top-down approaches tend to sort of conjure up an image of a nefarious cabal of undemocratic experts who are totally insensitive to the local impacts of their plans, whereas when we talk about bottom-up, community-driven stuff, we're often, there's this undifferentiated mass of community, and it's often characterized as somewhat nostalgic and resistant to large-scale change. And I think we need to sort of get beyond those two images to really kind of celebrate the individual voices of people who are both intervening and interpreting the city. This is an image that appears in the book from Patrick Geddes, who developed a variety of diagrammatic thinking machines, including this one, the widely examined notation of life, which advances a model of how individuals, societies, and environments interact, organized into 4 broad social categories: town, school, cloister, and city, and 4 broad affective categories: acts, facts, thoughts/dreams, and ideals. Geddes was a polymath. He started out as an evolutionary biologist. He lived from 1854 to 1932, before he started turning his attention to the practical application of sociology to urban development. He believed deeply in examining and understanding the existing city and its constant growth and transformation. And this is where I think he's a really interesting model for both the role of cultural institutions in all of this, as well as the role of observation, which I think is something that's really far too easily eclipsed by what we can measure. We have this incredible ability now to measure everything, and that seems to include our ability to learn through looking and to use observational and inductive approach to things. He talked a lot about conservative surgery, and he lived out his lesson as well as he preached about it. He and his wife moved to a very disinvested neighborhood in Edinburgh, and they did not, this is according to one biography, quote, Patrick and Anne did not want to carry on this work from the socially aloof and more comfortable quarters, and so they lived among the poor, providing them a vantage for their designs. It enabled them to acquire intimate knowledge, obtainable in no other way, of how the slum dwellers were actually affected by their surroundings, and of what could be the most readily done to improve them. And even when his career advanced to a stage where he and his wife were traveling all over the British Empire with making huge regional plans, incidentally, he designed the very first refugee camp for Armenians fleeing pogroms in the Ottoman Empire. He never sort of lost sight of this idea of conservative surgery, of really sort of learning through looking and only taking away what you need to take away in order to productively apply sociology towards a normative ideal of civics. And his inductive approach to urban planning, greatly informed by the scientific method he learned and practiced as a biologist, set him apart from many of his peers and successors in the incipient town planning movement, which was primarily populated by engineers and architects with little love for existing urban conditions, let alone citizen involvement. And this Outlook Tower, he created in the 1890s, and I'm reading this is from the book here. He created a prototype Outlook Tower in Edinburgh, taking over a property with a singular panoramic view of the city, in which a local optician had installed a camera obscura in a purpose-built turret. In this place, Geddes created a permanent exhibition, quote, arranged as an index museum to the universe that explained the various factors, geographic, cultural, historical, political, astrophysical, affecting the physical form and social experience of Edinburgh. Visitors would proceed from a display of astronomical charts that pinpointed Edinburgh's place in the cosmos, and then enter into a hollow globe through which they could see and come to understand the orbit of the Earth and stars beyond. From there, they could step out onto the parapet and look through a telescope at curated features of the urban and natural landscape. The displays continue to shift in scale, a room with a pair of goals, one in topological relief, another of vegetation and climate regions, a room on the British Empire. The Scotland room highlighted how the nation's physical geographies influence its social development. An extensive room on Edinburgh demonstrated his methodology for the regional survey, which he would become a well-known practitioner of. Throughout, the exhibits showcased, quote, typical samples of social and civic maldevelopments side by side with curative plans of redevelopment, actual and possible. For this reason, Charles Zublin, a prominent sociologist visiting from the University of Chicago in 1895, marveled that the Outlook Tower was the world's first sociological laboratory. So I end the technology chapter arguing that we need more Outlook Towers and fewer black boxes. And then I go on to write about housing, which I'm going to not talk about now, because I'm eager to hear questions and your own comments about how any of this resonates with what you're doing or thinking about as citizens. And really, I mean, the book concludes with a sort of passionate call on my part to kind of sum up all of this various work that I'd been sort of studying and the trend lines that it sort of indicated about where urbanism is headed, to really make a passionate call for seeing cities as infrastructures of solidarity. The reason that I personally am so passionate about cities is because of the forced confrontation with people so unlike oneself that, in my experience, it can't help but produce a certain kind of empathy. We know, which is something that this world desperately needs a little bit more of across lines of race and class and origin and activity and all kinds of other sort of othernesses, if you will. We know that cities reproduce and intensify very important inequalities, but we also know that there is a potential there that I think needs to be marshaled. The book sort of begins and ends with these three kind of existential threats that all of the stories in one way or another, even if their participants were not necessarily thinking of them in that way, are really the core sort of existential crises of our time. Climate change, widening inequality, and the third one, which gets a little bit less airtime, the crisis of trust between citizens and government. And so my hope with all of this work is to really try and lift up individual voices of people who are not necessarily at the top looking down or at the bottom looking up, but are actively, professionally, and passionately involved in making cities and neighborhoods a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more just, a little bit more inclusive. Thank you. And I'd be very happy to take any questions. Yes?
A little bit about me, just so I can frame the question a little better.
Please.
Whenever people from outside of New York ask me why I live here, I begin by telling them, well, I'm a single guy, not married, don't have any kids, and New York seems to be a perfect place for me to fit in. There's lots of people like me here. The question would be, has there been any attention paid in planning to like maybe neighborhoods or institutions that are more geared towards single-person households as opposed to more traditional families?
Absolutely, and in fact, I write quite a bit in the housing chapter, which I just skipped over, about a long-term project that the Architectural League worked on in collaboration with the Citizens Housing and Planning Council, which was, in one way or another, very much about that exact issue. While the building stock of New York City is wondrously diverse, the units within those buildings are remarkably homogeneous, much more so than one would actually think. And the vast majority of units of whatever sort of size in New York City are designed or originally designed for a nuclear family. And so this creates a tremendous amount of costs. And it really comes back to actually very progressive ideas about, back in the day, in the 20s and 30s, that good housing would create good people. And that everybody could, be a nice middle-class nuclear family with middle-class nuclear family values, and there would be no more public drunkenness and no more machine politics, and everybody would just be fine. And as a result, there are very, very, very limited options for not only single people who want to live alone, but even more important for certain demographics is unrelated single people who want to live together. It's illegal for 4 or more unrelated adults to share one household in New York City. Now, if it's 4 recent college graduates, that might not necessarily be enforced, but when it comes to 4 recent immigrants living in a basement in a single-family home in Queens, that becomes something that does often get enforced, and it often pushes a lot of people for whom the rental market has nothing for the kinds of households they want to create into, in some cases, unsanitary and unsafe housing on the black market. So there has been a lot of research into how to sort of match the existing demographics of New York City. New York City is 33% of New York City households are single person households, among those people who pay taxes. But that there's nowhere near 33% of living units available in New York City are designed for single person houses. So you have some people living with roommates in their 40s and 50s, and you have some people taking up more space than they necessarily need. So there are some efforts at the margins to kind of reform that and to make the sort of the units more responsive to shifting demographic needs. There's a great book called Going Solo by Eric Kleinberg that I recommend, which is about the sort of this great demographic shift, which he compares, he thinks is equally important to the shifts of the baby boom, the amount of people who choose to live alone. But there are some serious sort of policy roadblocks to getting that very observable trend to be matched by supply on the housing end. But there is a lot of work being done on it, and it's a very interesting area.
Are there roadblocks?
The minimum sizes is one of them. So I think it's 420 square feet is the smallest you can build right now. And which made a lot, I mean, the reason that again, these regulations came from a very progressive place, which was to eliminate the sort of predatory and squalid conditions of tenement living, primarily the Lower East Side, as it was documented in the early part of the 20th century. And so minimum room sizes was an attempt to kind of, regulate these kinds of very dangerous places out of existence. But what it has led to now in a booming sort of real estate market is when you have a minimum. So there are attempts like to have micro units, but other cities are far ahead of us in that. Seattle, Providence, Rhode Island, a lot of other cities are well. Seattle, I think, is probably done the most to kind of address the mismatch between demographics and housing regulations. Yes.
You said that you did not include a chapter on transportation, which I would argue is really, specifically mass transportation, key to organizing major cities. I mean, New York
Absolutely.
Is what it is, with a system designed to empty out the congestion of the slums, get people swiftly between decent housing and decent jobs. Is this a subject for later work by you, or what was your rationale for?
Perhaps it was. So I absolutely agree. I mean, I think public transportation is. I mean, when I'm talking at the end about how my passion for cities comes from the spectacular diversity that and my proximity to people unlike myself, what I'm thinking about is my subway ride for the most part, and absolutely, and I think there's another sort of trend that runs throughout the book is the idea of public goods and how we value them and what they are and what they're not. And there are a lot of stories historically of things that started out as private enterprise and then came to be expected as necessary infrastructure, eventually to be funded by government, and then now what we have now in a culture where infrastructure is not particularly well valued on either the left or the right politically, of a sort of devaluation, an emotional devaluation of the sort of downstream benefits of infrastructure, which absolutely applies, most obviously to public and mass transportation. When it came to the rationale for what the chapters were, it really had to do with the stories that I had been reporting over the years, and we did have a lot of stories about the subway and about buses on Urban Omnibus. It's a subject into itself in many ways that was outside the scope of what I could realistically bite off, but it is, I think you will find in the chapter on infrastructure a lot of philosophical, legal, and financial arguments that just as easily apply to mass transit as they do to the bridges and sort of waterways that I was talking about.
It seems to be an organizing principle for many cities.
Absolutely.
And where New York started with, in many cases, the transit first,
Yeah.
development to follow.
Absolutely.
Social engineering it.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, there's no getting around its importance. Yeah. Any other thoughts, reactions? Yes.
Well, first of all, wonderful photographs, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. But there's a certain irony in it, which is you started out doing these things on the web.
Yeah.
And what you decided to do is to harden it and put it into a
Yeah.
Did you ever consider just publishing a iBook which could be revised?
No. And then perhaps I'm revealing my own sort of conservative old schoolness. The web is an unbelievably amazing tool that I felt so fortunate to use for the kind of nimble, responsive, updatable things that it provided me as an editor. Also for the juxtaposition of different types of media, so we could really, when we were telling a story, we could choose the media to fit the content rather than, you know, having a certain, and that was especially as someone who was trained originally as a filmmaker and sort of then became an online journalist, somewhat by default, I really, really appreciated those aspects of the sort of simultaneity and the responsiveness and the nimbleness of the web. One of the things that I think a book is particularly good for was the ability that it provided to really have this be in dialogue with other books, and to sort of really mine and pull from. There's sort of a scale issue. I can't stand to read anything online that's more than 2,000 to 3,000 words. And so I wanted to write something longer that would give me sort of a meditative space to reflect on a lot of these things, but also to weave in some of the things that have influenced me, but also more importantly, influence the urbanists and the sort of city makers that I was writing about, and to sort of be in constant dialogue with that intellectual history. And for me, the format of a book really enabled one to do that in a very particular way that does have pretensions of permanence. Whether or not it is remains to be seen. But I think that there was a desire there to create something that was a marker of a very specific moment in time that couldn't be updated, because there's very much a timestamp on the whole thing. This is kind of a chronicle of new trends in urban practice between the financial crash of 2008 and 2016, and so I wanted it to be a capsule of that particular time. Written in 2017. Yes?
Hi, you mentioned how infrastructure became more and more utilitarian and minimal, but in the mid-19th century it was extraordinary, the artistic impulse of the city beautiful.
Absolutely.
How do you think that arose? Where did that impulse come from?
The impulse to make sort of
Beautiful.
I mean, there are a lot of different ways to answer that, and I might defer to the architectural historians in the room. One of the ways that I write about the City Beautiful movement in the book, which is in regards to Manhattan Bridge, but also I write about it in the context of Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, which is sort of an example of something that was designed as a public space. And I write here, sitting in front of you is a gentleman who works at the Design Trust for Public Space, which is how I first got involved with the Grand Army Plaza project way back in 2008, which was chronicling a story that was trying to, this thing that had been this sort of beautiful grand promenade that was very much designed as a kind of sort of moral and social uplift of a public space with grand iconic avenues and sort of vistas that led to the monuments, the Brooklyn Museum, the library, but it has become essentially a traffic circle, which I thought was emblematic of that sort of shift of infrastructures that were originally designed not only just to be beautiful, but also to serve multiple different modes of transit, multiple different kinds of social demands, being sort of slowly squeezed to meet just one need, which in that case was the need of automotive traffic over and above any other form of transportation or public space hanging out. But there are other examples that follow that same model. I think in terms of what the original impetus was in 19th century urban planning, I think honestly a lot of it was trying to compete with Europe and like just to make American cities seem grand and not pedestrian and working class, to be perfectly frank. There's a lot written about sort of the effects of the Columbian exhibition in 1893 in Chicago on how sort of popularizing that movement and bringing it to cities all over the country. But I think the thing that is important to recover from that philosophy is not just the beauty and the grand design, because of course a lot of City Beautiful schemes around monumentality have resulted in really, really devastating destruction. I'm thinking of the mall in Washington, D.C. is sort of the most egregious example of destroying whole neighborhoods to make, monumental public spaces. But I think what does need to be recovered is that sense that was in that system, that infrastructure and public space were conceived of as coordinated parts of a holistic system of city making. Yes?
So on the other end of Gary's question of why a book and not just on the web, why a book and not a movie and a documentary?
Yeah.
Since you do documentaries, I wonder if you have anything.
I think again it would be like, I would totally make the film if the Patrick Geddes of the world were still around and I could interview them. But all I have is their books. So what I kind of wanted to, what I loved about the book format, as someone who works in a lot of different kind of media and formats, is dialogue with intellectual history, which, because that's not an active one, I think there are aspects of this that would be great for film, but those are limited to the contemporary examples of things where something is visibly changing. There's also something, I'm passionate about the power of cinema to tell stories of urban change. It's what I teach my students at Columbia, and it's something that I care very deeply about. But something that writing is inherently much better at than filmmaking is conjuring things that aren't visible. Filmmaking is very much about what you can hear and what you can see. And a lot of the most interesting incremental changes that I think are really sort of pushing urbanism into new directions and pushing it towards these questions of ethics and equity are things that aren't necessarily visible. And I think those of us who love the built environment, fetishize the visible world, I think, in ways that are perfectly understandable, but that needs to be sort of complemented with sort of deep dives into the invisible underlying structures of things, legally, financially, and invisibly, which I think is something that happens, here, and I'm sure you contend with it curatorially. How do you talk about things that you can't necessarily visualize? And I really appreciated what a book allows, or what book writing allows you to do in that regard.
Part of the reason I ask is because the recent book on Jane Jacobs, Citizen Jane, it's about urbanism and resisting, and it's a film I didn't really like very much because of the message was so hard hammered, and I thought rather focused. And it seems like what you are explaining through the book are these other urbanisms without the judgment about what's good resistance, what's positive organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think there are some stories that are incredibly well suited to that, and particularly stories about the 60s because 50s and 60s because of the wealth of archival film material that you can use. Which I thought that they did a good job of that, even though I agree it was very sort of didactic. But another thing that I really enjoyed about this process was the lifting up of hundreds of different voices, which I think would have been kind of hard to do. But I do think there's work to be done and stories to be told that I'd like to do in different mediums, particularly now having spent better part of the last decade focusing on New York City, which is the city that I live in and the city that I love the most. I'm very interested now in telling stories about innovations happening in smaller cities, because I think there's definitely some truth to the notion that small cities innovate and large cities apply to a certain extent, and I think there's a lot of city making going on in smaller second-tier cities in this country that I'm very curious to learn more about, because I have come across in talking about this book around the country and around the world. People are like, yeah, but that's New York. That's different. You're so highly specific. The only place I didn't have that reaction was San Francisco and London. But I think that while I resist that, because I think there's a lot of things neighborhood to neighborhood that, East New York, for example, has learned a lot from similar urban agriculture experiments in Cleveland, and the list goes on and on. I think there is some truth to the fact that there are a lot of stories that deserve to be told and brought up to a different kind of scale of conversation happening in smaller places. And I'm very curious to sort of hear those stories and try and lift those up as well.
Any other questions? Well, you have the opportunity to ask more questions more informally because we have some wine and water over there. We also have some books if you want to get one. So I guess at this juncture, we just all thank Cassim.
Thank you guys so much.
Introduce you as well, but I thought I would precede that with a promo for our upcoming book talks, which have just recently been added to the website, so you may not have discovered them yet, but as a lot of you know, familiar faces. Who is new tonight to the museum? Well, welcome for the first time. Great. So in that case, I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. And once a month or sometimes more, we have an author's talk on topics: New York, urban skyscrapers, a wide range. But we love this format because it's quite intimate, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and have some conversation, and we especially want to do that after the talk. So an example of some of the other topics, and coming up on February 13th is a book by the urban historian Alison Eisenberg on designing San Francisco, art, land, urban renewal in the city by the bay, which seems like a really nice historical precedent for the topics that we're going to cover tonight. And then on February 20th, the Sustainable City, Stephen Cohen, who is the executive director of the Earth Institute up at Columbia, is going to be talking about these practical aspects of urban environmentalism. So we have a wide range of topics. And if I put these down, and now I hold up Citymakers, I'll give a brief introduction of Cassim Shepard, who has a very eclectic bio, which seems very appropriate to this book, which is highly eclectic too. And I'll read from the things that he thinks are important in his bio as sent, because Cassim brings together nonfiction media about cities, buildings, and places. He's trained as an urban planner and as a geographer and a documentary filmmaker. And he served as the founding editor for Urban Omnibus. And the person who wrote the grant application for the Urban Omnibus is sitting right there, Rosalie Ginevro, who also wrote the introduction to this book. So we have a family group here tonight, and that's why we especially want to leave time when he speaks for about half an hour to have some discussions and exchange, because I know that there are a lot of people here who are practical urbanists themselves. So among the things that he has been doing since he became the founding editor of Urban Omnibus and served for, I think, 6 years in that position, he worked with hundreds of local architects, designers, writers, and public servants to share their stories of urban innovation, which are collected here. His film and video work has been commissioned by and screened at the Venice Architecture Biennale, at the Cooper Hewitt, at the United Nations, and lots of other places. He teaches urban design at GSAPP, Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. And he's been a guest lecturer in a whole bunch of different places in the city's program at the LSE, London School of Economics, at at NYU in their Public Knowledge Institute. He studied filmmaking at Harvard, urban geography at King's College in London, and urban planning at MIT. So Citymakers, The Culture and Craft of Practical Urbanism, a Monticelli Press book, is his first book, but he did a whole lot of writing before that with Urban Omnibus and then a lot of other places. So this is a compendium of experience, and I guess a kind of slice and dice of many, many projects. So I'm delighted that you're going to try to coalesce them for us, or to...
I will try my best. Thank you so much, Karen.